My name is Jennifer Buwersi, and I'm one of the co-founders of Music for Your Inbox. And today we're going to have another one of our artist chats with interdisciplinary artist Ashton Phillips, who's the kind of lead mind behind the sound film we have this month on Music for Your Inbox. So I will get him invited, and we'll talk about this really cool project.
Great. Hi. So good to see you today. Thanks for joining us. And I was saying we're going to talk about the really cool film you have or the mastermind, I would say, behind, and we'll talk about all the structures. I thought it might be nice to kind of talk about your interests more broadly to begin. So you describe your kind of creative interest. I'm going to read because I just love the words you use to describe it. Your interest as being in the transness of material, the plasticity of bodies, human and non-human, and the promise of queer ecological praxis as pathways for making meaning, building resiliency, and generating new forms of knowledge, feeling, and being in the late Capitalocene. So I would love if you could talk about what you mean by, especially like the transness of material and the plasticity of bodies in particular, and like how like queer experiences and wisdom are like woven into your ecological art practice.
Thank you, Jen. That is a sort of like perfect question to receive to open up talking about my practice and this work together. I know it's sort of an ambitious way of describing what I'm doing, but I mean, I feel like I am really oriented towards material and sort of processual transformations. And so it's fun to be able to talk about it directly at the beginning of an interview. Mm-hmm. I would say I think about the transness of material in several different ways. First of all, I'm thinking about material as a kind of the formlessness of material, how material shifts and evolves and adapts. And if you think of like even the word plastic, I've been like in a kind of like nerdy deep dive about all of these things for some time, but the word in Greek and Latin is similar, plastikos and plasticus, which literally means fit for molding or moldable. So if we think of a material like clay, we can kind of understand how it can be moldable, or even plastic, like the word plastic predates petroleum-based plastic, but it was used for this petroleum-based material because it was so moldable and really like replaced clay. But there's like a deeper way that material is formless, that's like less visible, that I'm like, interested in and have been exploring for some time, that I think about as really challenging this normativity. So I wrote about this in an essay recently, but if we think about like, if we engage with people kind of categorically by wanting to identify who they are, what they are, or even identify what a material is, we're engaged on this kind of categorical level of understanding. But if we start to look at what everything is made out of, those categories kind of dissolve. Their artifice becomes more legible to us. So there's a way that like, if I think, and I do, I think about my own body, not necessarily as like, whatever, I'm interested in categories and semantics and use pronouns and have identities like anyone else. But I do spend a lot of time thinking about the materiality of my own body and like by extension, other bodies as something that's, made, like I'm made of carbon, I am made of fat, I am made of sea salt and small amounts of synthetic testosterone and microplastics and like whatever I had for breakfast that hasn't been digested yet. And like none of these materials are really mine. And there's, Jane Bennett wrote about some of this kind of stuff in Vibrant Matter, which comes up sometimes when I'm talking about my practice or people are asking me about it. I don't know if you've ever come across this book before. So she actually came to visit my grad school program, which was a treat. She teaches at Johns Hopkins. She's like a philosopher, political economist, and she wrote this book about 10 or 15 years ago called Vibrant Matter. And in that book, she's applying Deleuze, which is sort of this materialist philosopher who gets accused of being a metaphysicist, which, maybe I am too. But she talks about like the ecologies of trash, the vibrancy of matter. And she has this line that like I remember a lot and comes up a lot, I think, which is talking about the non-human within the human body. And like the microbiome as a good example of this. So we sort of know there's like bacteria and fungi and all of these different things that are helping us like live and also affecting our mind. There's a lot of like science out right now about having your hands in dirt actually enriches your microbiome. And that is one of the pathways to like gardening makes us feel happier and healthier. But so she says the theys inside me outnumber the me's.
I love that.
Like number of cells, right? And there's a kind of like disorientation about embodiment, maybe a kind of dysphoria even that's available from that framing, which seems very trans relevant to me, even if she's not kind of like positioning it that way. For me, I think I'm like looking at something similar, but a little bit different, which is more like none of this is me, like none of it is more me or less me.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's probably a long answer.
I love a long answer. Well, and I wanted to kind of tease out, I think one thing that strikes me about a lot of your work with this like idea of what's me and not me is you're taking like a really long time view of it, which I think is really beautiful. There's the moment of not me, but then you also think a lot of like metabolism, decay, like how we are part of like larger cycles. Is that part of what you think of when you're thinking of like plasticity too? Is not even beyond just like momentary. It's also like the amount of change that happens.
Definitely. Absolutely. Like nothing in our bodies is stable.
Right.
But if we think of like having all this discourse right now about who's a real man, who's a real woman, who's allowed to go into a bathroom, who's allowed to change their legal documents. And there's this presumption of gender and sex as this like essentially stable thing, as an attribute of the body that is so fundamental and essentialized and incapable of shifting. And it's really kind of absurd and, at odds with the way that material changes and flows in general.
Yeah. I love that, especially because I think, as a time-based artist myself, like anything that kind of like stretches. Well, I love how you're like, you're really towing these and spaces where like something can have specific semantic meaning and it can change, and it can be, an object or a material with different forms in different times. I like that you're able to recognize both ways of looking at an object or a thing or a material or a way of being. It's one of the really cool and interesting ways about things about your work that I love so much. And I think, so one thing I want to dive into kind of specifically that is really present in a lot of your work and really related to this idea of like changing plastic materials. Not literally plastic, but plastic as in like changeable, moldable, is you have you have a mealworm colony that is a part of your art project that you tend to, you raise and could you tell us about them and maybe some basics too for like people who really don't know what's up, like their diet, how you care for them and like how they're incorporated into your art practice?
Yes, I would be happy to talk to you about mealworms for
Yay,
as long as you will listen. So I started working with mealworms, which is just, they're the sort of common mealworm insect that many of you may have engaged with or encountered, that you might get fed to chickens or get fed to reptiles. Started working with them a few years ago because when I moved to Long Beach, I was like noticing and responding to a huge amount of styrofoam pollution on the beach and like the playground where my kids play, all around me. And I had been working previously with contaminated dirt, with site-specific dirt that had heavy metals in it. And then I had researched and was starting to work with bioactive agents, in that case fungi and plants, like specific plants, that could eat and metabolize some of those contaminants out of the dirt. So it's already thinking about these kind of relationships and the time-based process of healing that is not controlled really directly by humanity. And the poetics of that, and sort of personally wanting to spend time with that process and then sharing that as the work. When I moved here. And so then I saw the styrofoam and I thought, I wonder if these because it's really pretty, miraculous. And I'm just learning. I'm like discovering as I'm going. I wonder if these fungi that I'm working with can also eat styrofoam, if they can eat heavy metals and petroleum byproducts out of the soil, maybe they could. And the short answer was like, no, or at least no one has found that yet. But I discovered quite quickly this study out of Stanford from 2015, which is like not that long ago. Finding that this common mealworm insect, the Tenebrio molitor is its like Latin name, can actually biodegrade styrofoam plastic in its body. And it doesn't hurt the insect. It can still metamorphose. They are like, in kind of common human culture, it's not readily understood that the mealworm is actually a metamorphosing insect. So it's in that worm shape temporarily, but it actually is a fully metamorphosing creature, which I relate to very much as this sort of like, there's a transpoetics to that. But they don't turn into this sort of like beautiful femme butterfly. They turn into this little black beetle that most people relate to as roach-like and somewhat scary. So I've been keeping them so I find that kind of charming and identify with that. But I've been keeping them for several years, and I feed them mostly styrofoam, which again, I think of as, pretty miraculous and incredible that they can do this, and this material metamorphosis is happening at its own pretty slow time scale. There's content in that too. They're not just like fixing it,
Right.
We're kind of, our culture has this like on-demand expectation of everything. But then I also feed them carrots and like wildflowers, and there's a performative reference to this sort of like ancient human practice of laying flowers on things that we think are worthy of reverence. So I'm thinking about that as I'm kind of going through these practices, but it is also feeding them and giving them supplemental nutrition and water. So, yeah. So that's kind of how I take care of them. I think, there's also like a kind of, you asked me about queerness in the last question. There's definitely a queer, like if you think of the word queer as opposed to gay or whatever, there's like an attitude.
Yeah.
Like a kind of defiance, it's like a little punk. It's like, it's reclaiming a slur. Like maybe we forget that now because it's so common, but when it was reclaimed, it was really about being like, yeah, maybe I am that. And like, what are you going to do about it? Like, I am queer. Like, let's be filthy. Let's be nasty. I'm not going to assimilate myself into whatever kind of heteronormative standards you have about acceptability and respectability and politeness. And so for me, like bringing these insects into art spaces is some of that attitude,
Totally. That is, I'm so glad you like kind of pointed that out, because I think what's really cool too about experiencing your work is, and something I'm interested in an artist is there's like the sensation of meaning that happens with artists like yourself who think so deeply about like all of the different pieces that are coming and kind of get like beautifully obsessed about information and the relationships. And as a viewer, I feel like we can sense that, but I love hearing you kind of point out the different parts of it because it really makes it vivid and exciting. And I think maybe this is a good moment to kind of talk about the exact project that we worked on together. So we were so lucky to get to kind of help you realize a film version of a performance called Feast Cycle. And so this was done with Pure Filth Society members and including the mealworms. And the way this kind of worked is that the folks in Pure Filth created this performance, and then we helped film it from the Music for Your Inbox team. It's very, pink and purple color cast, and we get to see Ashton sculptures and the performance from the different members. It's very ritual, and very like close up on the touch of everything, of all of the instruments and the objects and the music, and the different sounds also feel kind of very tactile and close and crunchy. And like I mentioned, the piece is performed by Pure Filth Society, and I would love it if you could talk about that project, because my understanding is it's kind of an ongoing collaborative project, like who's involved and and specifically how you work together to make this performance.
Yeah, I would be happy to. It was really an honor to be able to work with you guys and to work with them to bring this vision into being in space, and then to have this film that captures something really different, I think, about it. You know, like we talked a little bit about like there's this kind of mealworm idea.
Yeah.
There's like mealworms idea, right? So the Pure Filth Society is a collective of artists that are interested in queer and trans ecology, that are interested in speculative ritual, that are interested in interspecies collaborations or like imaginaries, and decomposition or assemblage as really strategies. And, I kind of came to each of the members of the collective intuitively. But when asked to think about what is it that we share that kind of brings us together, I really think all of those things are true for each of us. And so we work in multisensory installations, but in a sound forward and performance mode. So we have Sadie Grayduck on the bass, who is amazing and came down from San Francisco for this performance. She is classically trained and has, you can hear it, like a ton of experience with jazz improvisation, experimental jazz. She's also a sculptor herself and calls herself a glass witch. She makes these really beautiful, also very ritualistic objects that are also super defiant and have a kind of queer attitude about them out of broken liquor bottles that she assemblages together as stained glass. She's also referencing Catholic ritual and practice, but really transing it. And for this performance, she is mostly playing the bass, and you'll hear as she goes through, there's something that happens. I think it's really legible on her part, but I think it's also happening with other performers and in the collective through the performance. But where she's really listening to, and she's sort of becoming the water, the worms, the footsteps. And there's this sort of shifting that's happening where it's like you can hear these textures, but you can't quite tell what they are, who's performing them, how they're being made. And that for me is like a very queer sensory space, also a little static space. And this kind of disorientation, that comes from that is definitely something I'm interested in as an experience for the listener, viewer. We also have Eden Nudala, who's a performance artist, primarily a performance artist, but also has a sound and visual art practice. Who is performing in space, kind of performing as this animating force. You'll see they're sort of passed off. They receive some kind of tactile energy or they touch. The mealworms, the styrofoam, I sort of give them something, which I think of as this animating plastic force. And then they physically move around the space and they sort of pass this energy, this force, which is performed as a rhythm, as breath to each of the other participants. And Eden has, I'm not sure what will come of the bear, but Eden has a long-standing interest in performing sort of interspecies relationships with the bear, but has also performed mealworm for me more than several times. It's a dancer and sound artist. And then the last, not count, if the last human member of the collective is Dylan Rickards, who is an experimental musician, like a ton of history in making synthetic sound. And so he's playing the synth and then this like beautiful gong instrument that he made to play as part of this collective, and a sculptor. So you can see sort of like multiple modalities from him there. And then I really love, for him, I really love how that gong plays in the video. It's like the way it bounces, the reflection, it like fractures the image, and also does this kind of queer phenomenology disorientation thing really beautifully.
Yeah. I wanted to, like, one of the really interesting things you brought up about the film, which is a big thing we talked about, was, because film is a visual medium. And even though kind of as an organization, our roots are in music and my background is in music, so we think a lot about the sound, and we really think about how the visual medium can support the sound and also create different perspectives than you might experience in performance. So when we were talking a lot in early days about what is this going to look like and how will that shape the experience of the performance, and something that film can do that performance spaces can't necessarily do very well is this extremely close view, a kind of obscured view. For example, Eden is, like you said, doing these kind of circuits around the room that are instigating the different parts of the piece, but you can't see Eden always. There is a bit of, as a viewer, you're not kind of given a maybe this is the wrong word for it, but like a God view. Like, you don't get the ultimate perspective of the performance. You get to see windows into the performance and piece it together for yourself. And a big part of that decision was this idea of hierarchy and power and visual presence being something that did equate to like power in a visual medium. So, and this was like really important to you, especially in regard to the mealworm colony, that we didn't set this up as like a human view, or like I mentioned, maybe like a God view. So can you talk about, some of the things that are important to you about viewpoints, or even the way you turned out? You were mentioning some things about the way it turned out that gave you the sensations you were hoping for in terms of like hierarchy and power, the sensation of it all. Sorry, messy question.
No, thank you. I'm really happy to address that. It is really important to me. I think like it came up initially for me, my thinking about this came up because I have been working with these mealworms for several years and taking them out with me and wanting to like share what they're doing, share something about what it feels like to be with them. Also this sort of provocation of suggesting that people might want to like put their face really close to these bugs, so they can hear this beautiful sound, but also they have to put their face close to these bugs in order to hear it. And often, very often, people would react mostly with this kind of like, well, I can't see them. Where are they? Are they here? Are they really here? Or is this a recording? And like basically wanting to get like, they were more interested in making sure they weren't being tricked, and that they knew that they wanted certainty about the facts. And they also wanted a big eye, like a big look at this sort of freaky thing that was happening. And so it was triggering for me, like something of like this trans experience of being exposed to what is like, I've been talking about as a cis gaze, where there's this sort of, there can be this expectation that, that trans people are objects, that they should be required to reveal who they really are to everyone. And that if they're hiding something about their bodies, that they're tricking people, and that it enrages people. And so I was very interested in this parallel between these two things. And I got to write about this. I wrote an essay about it that was, published last summer in a journal called the Antennae Journal of Nature and Visual Culture. They had like a queering nature issue, and that was really cool for me. But so it remains really present for me. And then I'm thinking about opacity as a strategy, so there's Edward Glissant, this post-colonial theorist, wrote in the Poetics of Relation, wrote about opacity, and like I'm not the only one thinking about his writing right now and how it relates to the world. But in my work in particular, there's this idea that clarity and light and like a full spectrum gaze is always true and noble and good, and the darkness and the subterranean and the insect and the hiding is always sort of like associated with evil. Maybe especially like Judeo-Christian, I should do it like Catholic tradition, which is my background. It's, clearly, but so there's I'm interested in opacity as a move that protects the vulnerable, and as a provocation, a form of resistance against this sort of like lecherous desire. When you talk about the male gaze, I think there's a lot of like, oh yeah, like we want to, it's like a sexual objectification. And the cis gaze can certainly be that too, but it can also be something more kind of like this scientific gaze or this colonial gaze. In any of those cases, I think opacity for a visual artist can be an interesting form of resistance. And then the question is like, how do you do that? And so for me, I've looked at like darkness or like darkened spaces, something like illegibility or ambiguity, like I was saying with the sound, like when you can't tell, is this a human making this sound with their mouth? Is it actually an insect? Is it an instrument? But also like the camera work does a lot of this.
Yeah, it's
which is cool
really,
for me.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you we mentioned like the cis gaze. Something that really kind of came out a lot when you were describing this is kind of an entitlement and a demand for information, ownership, possessiveness. That like I see how like in a way you're shaping opacity as a boundary of like, well, you can't just possess freely just because you see and want.
Right.
And I can really, you mentioned in your artist statement, new ways of knowing in the late Capitalocene. Excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I can really see how that relates to this idea of like feeling an entitlement to possess or own or understand, and this being a real form of resistance against that kind of like zeitgeist or entitlement to that way of kind of conquesting spaces that can and could be private or unknowable. And you also touched on something else in the film that I think is really, really stunning, and maybe not. It's one of those things you can sense, but I would love for you to talk about it directly if you are interested in, which is there's this structure that makes a lot of references to religious ritual. And you mentioned your kind of Catholic background.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could kind of just like, to start, kind of describe in bare terms, like kind of how the piece is structured, which for people who have seen it might be really interesting for a rewatch. I would highly recommend. And then maybe talk about some of the references you're making and why you're drawn to them.
Yeah, sure. So the piece is structured around this idea of like animating a plastic body that is made through all of the members of the collective and through a assemblage of materials, both synthetic and organic. And so it begins with this sort of voice of the mealworms in the styrofoam, and there is and me handling them. So this is the first relationship that's presented, and so you hear this touch, you hear this kind of crunching, which I do think about the way that as a listener that activates your own sense of embodiment. Like,
yes,
I want to address the listener's body.
Yes.
As
well, and the way and the way we were able to mix it too, which is maybe just me being a nerd, but I think about sound, closeness is like a perceptual nature of sound. And the sounds that you were using a microphone as an instrument, where the closeness of the microphone to the actions you were taking to the mealworms. What's so cool as a sensation for the viewer is that you can hear the sounds as they're close, but then later in the piece, you'll have sounds that are farther away. And so that's a really vivid experience as a listener, that kind of perceptual change that I loved from your performance.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. That, it's like a sonic way of getting, of getting to this mealworm eye gate, like the subjectivity of the insect in the position, like in the tank with the insect, hearing what they're hearing, and maybe like experiencing a little bit of what it would feel like to chew this material yourself.
Yeah.
And kind of become plastic and also become miraculous through it.
And to have the discomfort of something very close to you and then to become comfortable with that. And a beauty of the film medium is you have a lot of, especially for like on-demand viewing, is you have a lot of agency in your, you're listening. So you can have a sound that's very upon you. And if you need a break, you pause and listen again. But it's good. I don't know. I feel like it's very enriching, at least, to have that sensation of very, very closeness. What if I were in the tank? What would it feel like to chew these things? But anyways, I interrupted you describing the process. So it starts out with these very close sounds, almost as if we're in the tank. And then how do we move from there?
Right. And then I'm kind of waking up the mealworms or like bathing myself in them. And then Eden comes over and we have this moment where we're like mirroring each other's movements. And then I am passing off this role of touching, contacting, engaging with, sharing flesh and agency with the mealworms in the plastic to Eden, who is, a generation younger than me. So there's also this, like, I think there's some kind of like apprentice acolyte read available or something about time, there of like, I'm doing this work and now I'm passing this work off to you.
Absolutely.
And then Eden, while we're together, I start this like beat, and the beat carries throughout the whole piece. And it's meant to reference, there's first this like field of touch, and then there's this beat to reference a heartbeat, but not a heartbeat that's necessarily human and not a heartbeat that's actually my heartbeat. I'm not using the stethoscope to hear my heartbeat, but I'm creating a beat using plastic, using insects, using my body, using this microphone. And that is passed off, heard and echoed by Eden, who then carries it around in a circle around the space. And so this beat builds and moves, and then breath is added, both through human breathing into the microphone, but then also through these sounds that sound like breathing with other materials. And Eden circles this center space where the mealworms are, and then wakens up Sadie and Sadie's base. There's a beautiful moment in the film. I feel like it's so Baroque, it sort of like recalls, or like a Renaissance kind of Michelangelo sculpture. I mean, even like, the Pietà in the Vatican, something there, like transing that relationship of this like larger woman figure over this younger, more masculine reading figure. Anyway, and Sadie is woken up, and her hand, she's like, she's playing the bass not just as a stringed instrument with this sort of like bellowing voice, but also as a material that has a sort of tactility of wood and touch and this kind of scraping, more insect-like sounds. And then Eden continues circling and then wakes up Dylan with the gong, and also more breath. Now you have these more voices of breathing together, multivocal, and more complexity of sound, building this like body that is listening to itself, like an ecosystem of sound that continues to hold both synthetic and organic sounds, like the sounds of human bodies, the sound of insects bodies, the sounds of plastic bodies, like literally styrofoam bodies and mud. And then it was important to me to have this sort of like beautiful human instrument of the bass, and also that feels very acoustic and sort of like organic as sound goes, with the synthetic sounds of this metal vibration on the gong and the synth that Dylan's adding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so this like the intensity and complexity builds, and the multiplicity builds. And then at the end, there's this loud vocalization, this sort of like centering hum that brings the piece to a close, that's performed by Eden.
Mm-hmm. From a sound person's view, I love it when form mirrors concept, and to have this be like a very structured improvisation where everyone's contributing individual voices and has a lot of freedom within kind of the collaborative effort, I think just really is such a good choice for the concepts you're dealing with. And it's really and that's always like very satisfying to me. And then I think the other thing you brought out about like kind of like how Sadie's playing the bass and the sense of touch, I feel like all of you really approached your instruments from a perspective of materiality rather than technical, this is how you play this instrument kind of tidy technique, which again fits so well with the concepts you were working with. So for example, Sadie, beautifully trained, made all of the most amazing bass sounds, but also treated the bass as a resonant body that could be tapped and scraped and a material. So that was just really, really, really great to see those kind of concepts play out in like structure and form and material. And you mentioned some of the like kind of religious references you're making. What draws you to include those in a performance?
Yeah, so there's I'm interested, like I said, I was raised Catholic, and I'm interested in Catholic ritual. I think it works in a couple different ways, and I like that it can be read a couple different ways. But so one is like, it could be read as a critique of Catholic practice. Like if I'm pretty legibly referencing the sacrament of the Eucharist, but instead of presenting this like sanctified host, I am presenting styrofoam that is being eaten by mealworms. There's a read that is available that I'm interested in, but not attempting to like push down anyone's throat. But there's a read to be had about the plasticity of this this thing that questioning what is being worshipped, and the suggestion that what is being worshipped is decaying.
Mm-hmm. Well, even you refer to sometimes as your tanks as like kind of an altar space, and the center was kind of an altar space, and it was, it wobbled. It was, built on this kind of crushable tower of styrofoam. Yeah. I can definitely see that critique of like, what are the foundations? Are they decaying? This kind of tenuousness. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then you see so much marble in altars. It's just like very formal performance of power and permanent. But the materials that I'm kind of recreating these forms out of are wobbly, are impermanent, are alive, not permanent at all, kind of like constantly shifting. But I also think one of the main things that has drawn me to these references is this actual kind of like sincerity of reverence for these insects. It is miraculous that they can do this, and that is interesting. There's so much that we worship as humans that is deeply toxic. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of religious practice itself. Mm-hmm. But also you could say in capitalism we're worshiping, consumption and alcohol or whatever,
Yeah.
So I think I'm using Catholic, sort of this cultural background as a way of gesturing towards my own sort of admiration for these insects and what they can do.
Mm-hmm. And I love in your work how it can be both of those things at once.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be like you're either critiquing or exalting. It's like it's an and situation where there's a lot of richness to dive into and think about, because that's what good provocative work is making you do, is think about things. So yeah, thank you for kind of walking us through that, because I know as someone who's involved in the project, having a insight into some of those references made me notice them in a more kind of like specific way that really made my viewing of the film. I think it's one that's worth multiple viewings in that way. There's like a first blind viewing where you just take it in, but then there's having some of the information about the inner workings really can make a second viewing really rich.
Thank you.
So I think my last question, I always like to know, like, was there anything about this project in particular, or this form of the project, that surprised you, or anything that we missed in our conversation that you want to kind of point out for people?
I think I was really impressed with the sound itself, the video and the sound, but I haven't had, I spend a lot of time, with the mealworms eating styrofoam. And so there's especially at night when I'm all alone, there's so much complexity and fidelity that I can hear, but I've never been able to share that with others like this. And I think too, I have collaborated with the mealworms a lot, and I have collaborated with other members of the Pure Filth Society a good amount, but I haven't brought them both together like this before. I've kind of kept them separate. And I do think that including other human voices and instruments, both, as musicians, their sort of creative voice, but also the voices of the materials and instruments that they are bringing, added a huge amount of complexity and content that I'm so happy with to be able to share. So I would say that I was optimistic that it would be amazing, but it's enriched my practice much more than I could have imagined. And I'm, the final result is we had a little viewing party at my house.
I love that.
Everyone was so happy, and it was like a happy thing to be able to share amongst us too. So yeah.
Well, awesome. For anyone watching it is out or watching now. This film is available until the end of December. People can grab tickets, and you can also see beautiful mail art by Alicia Pillar that is paired with this. It's kind of a deep digital reconfiguration of a sculpture called Broken Record Reconfiguration and Alicia's dealing with a lot of beautiful materials and questioning the way materials can be restructured to reflect kind of reconfigurations in communities, and whether those changes are for better or for worse, which I love that. So thank you so much for for trusting us with your art, and it's been a really rewarding collaboration for us and for talking with us today. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I'll see you. Have a great winter break and winter solstice coming up.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.